Thank you, Mr. Mayor, City Council. We are at the point with our long-range multimodal transportation plan that it's ready, in our opinion, it's ready to be adopted. Moscow on the Move was intended as a 20-year strategy that proposed short and long-term improvements to our citywide road network, as well as the bicycle and pedestrian system and the local transit service. Back a few years ago, we began a competitive selection process. We put out a statement for a statement of qualifications and received 13 responses. We had a panel that reviewed those. We narrowed them down to 3 consultants and interviewed those 3. We ended up selecting a nationally recognized transportation planning firm, Nelson Nygaard, folks from their office in Portland. And their team included transportation engineers, DKS and Associates of Portland, which did, who did the transportation engineering in terms of the traffic analysis and the modeling. Also, another consultant on the team was Alta Planning, who are also nationally known for their expertise in bicycle and pedestrian planning. During the process, we gathered lots of data. We funneled data to Nelson Nygaard and also solicited comments and opinions from a large cross-section of the community. We had a steering committee that includes the following representatives, and I want to read this list. The city members of the City Council, the Transportation Commission, Police Department, Fire Department, Planning and Zoning Commission, Gritman Medical Center, the University of Idaho, the Disability Action Center, the North Lake Tahoe Highway District, the Chamber of Commerce, Mobility Task Force, the Moscow School District, Paradise Path Task Force, Parks and Recreation, and Idaho Transportation Department. I want to thank all of those folks. Their names are right inside the front cover of of your plan, the final version. We also had a technical advisory committee, which consisted of the community development director, the public works director, the city engineer, streets and fleet division manager, and the University of Idaho parking and transportation services manager. Also the Smart Transit executive director and another member of the Transportation Commission. Tom Brennan, who was the project manager for Nelson Nygaard. He's also the manager of their Portland office. Tom has a Master's of Science degree in Community and Regional Planning from the University of Oregon and over 20 years of experience in transportation planning. Tom played a leading role in this plan and also in some of the most successful strategic plans around the country. He gets around. He's here to present Moscow on the Move for adoption by the City Council. Please help me welcome Tom.
Tom?
Thanks, Kevin. You never told me we were lucky number 13.
You were.
Excuse me for a minute while I get the presentation up here. Ready?
Okay.
Mr. Mayor and members of the council, it's a pleasure to be here in your fine community again. I think probably one of the best things about working on this project is I've gotten the opportunity to come to Moscow for 2.5 years now on a fairly regular basis. I joke with Kevin here that I'd worked in Pullman many, many times over the last 10 years and never made it to this side of the border. And when I actually got here, I was happily surprised to learn that this was really the jewel of the Palouse here, not your neighbor across the border. So it's been a lot of fun working here in your fine community. So as Kevin laid out, we're at a pretty exciting point in time on what's been a very fun and extensive look into your community transportation system here in Moscow. And I think really a great testament to the value that the community puts into your transportation system and how it affects community lives. There's not a lot of cities around the country of your size that have put this type of effort into developing a multimodal transportation plan. So we want to talk a little bit about why it's important that the community has this type of plan. Really want to stress the amount of input and the type of community input that we've had throughout the last 2.5 years. And then talk a little bit about the components of the plan and how this plan will move forward. I do want to stress that it's a pretty extensive document for the city. Hopefully folks have had a chance to look at it. I know several of you have been very involved. So we're not going to get into the nitty-gritty details, but we want to provide a strong overview of where the plan takes us. So as we initiated this plan, we went through a pretty extensive conversation about why this plan was important. It's clear in our day and age that transportation is really about more than just mobility and getting around, but it's part of recognizing your community vision that's set forth in the transportation plan in terms of how the city grows and how people experience their community. Moscow wanted to be ready to make smart, strategic investments to support future growth. One of the things we know in the transportation business is that transportation funding is increasingly scarce nationally, as well as around the state and here locally. So being ready to jump on opportunities to gain new funding through grant programs is really an important outcome of this plan. We want to make sure we have an equitable transportation system. You've got a really broad set of users of the system here. We want a system that works for everybody and really for all modal options. You've got a lot of people here that come without cars or have limited access to cars for reasons of age or ability or just the fact that they're a poor college student and can't afford one. So we want to make sure we have good transportation options for those folks as well. So some key elements of the project, as I'll talk a little bit more about, we've gone through an extensive public and detailed stakeholder engagement process. Spent a lot of time reviewing your existing facilities, the transportation services that the city and others provide, how people are actually moving about to and from your community. Went through a pretty extensive community transportation needs assessment, both from a database standpoint, but also from the standpoint of really just getting out and talking to people. We prioritized a lot of those needs that we saw and heard through a goal-based process. And I'll talk about developed modal plans for not just your traffic systems, but for pedestrians, for transit, for cyclists, and also started to think about what we call transportation demand management. So this includes capital programming, both in the short and long term. That's proposes a set of capital improvement projects, as well as a funding strategy. So this may be a little hard to see. Basic intent of this slide is to show that we've went through a three-phase process. We've engaged open public meetings at each point in the process, the first being really that data collection and learning about your systems. The second piece being data analysis, and as I'll talk about, we've developed some cool new tools to use as you plan your transportation system and how that interacts with land use here, specifically a travel demand model, which I'll talk about in a minute. And then, the final phase of the plan, really working with that data to set priorities for all of the modes we talked about. Both the technical and the broader steering committee that Kevin spoke about spent a good amount of time at the outset of this process really thinking about what the guiding principles were for Moscow and how you invest your limited transportation dollars. So obviously, mobility and access are at the top of the list. We need to move people around. We want to focus on the places people need to get to and how they get there, which is really that access principle. Secondly, recognizing that your street system is 30+% of the public space in your community. It has a significant impact on the look, the feel, how people experience your city and your public spaces. Some of your best public spaces are your main street downtown. So really thinking about how we can create better streets to create better places for people. Economic resilience Again, this is something we see more and more these days, communities focusing on the need for transportation to deal with natural disasters, to make sure that their economy stays strong. Land use, connection to land use is very important. Safety is obviously a top priority of this plan. A lot of interest from your community about active and healthy living and the role that transportation plays in that. That's not to say everyone's going to walk or bike, but having that ability and capacity to walk and bike in your neighborhood, in your community, is something that's valued very highly by people in this city. And then obviously the environment and the impacts and effects of transportation on the environment were important as well. So as I mentioned, the plan as you have it in front of you has 4 major modal strategies. So there's a roadway piece that looks at traffic operations. There's what we call active transportation, which is really bike and pedestrian plans and actions. There's a section on parking and transportation demand management, more focused on the downtown core. And then transit is the 4th piece of that. All those are pulled together into a 20-year prioritized work plan with short and long-term actions. That's where the proposed capital improvement plan is housed as well. One thing I would stress is that if you adopt this plan, the capital improvement program is a living thing. It's something that your staff can update regularly as priorities change. As I mentioned earlier, and as I'm sure you well know, transportation finance is a significant challenge these days. So having flexibility and ability to adjust to grant sources as they become available for specific projects is really important in the transportation business. So as I mentioned, we extended a really broad and engaging community outreach strategy during this process that had a number of different source inputs. We surveyed, we met with people, we went out and talked to individual stakeholders. We had actually 3 open houses during the process, 2 of which were designed to help identify key challenges. Both occurred right in this room. We had folks around maps, putting dots on maps, telling us where they thought improvements were needed, where they felt unsafe. We had a very successful drop-in community workshop. We were all day at the One World Cafe. People popped in. Some people sat with us for hours and talked about transportation in the community. Some just came in and let us know what their hot button issues were. We got a lot of really fantastic input from that session. Again, as we've talked about, we've had both a technical committee that we work with on a very, very regular basis, as well as the broader steering committee you see pictured here that we met with regularly throughout the process, and those folks were heavily involved in reviewing and giving us feedback on the document as we move forward. We also conducted a number of one-on-one stakeholder interviews with key groups around the community. Just some general findings from those. Very high level of satisfaction with city services. People were extremely complimentary about the types of investments the city was making, and certainly the city's responsiveness in dealing with transportation problems and issues as they came up. Pedestrian improvements were identified as a very high priority, filling in gaps in the sidewalk network, for example. As many of you, I'm sure, are aware, east-west connectivity in the community is another issue that was seen to be very critical, particularly as residential neighborhoods grow out to the east and people are trying to travel east-west through the community. There's been a lot of talk about bypass. There's been previous work on a community bypass or ring road. We did some additional modeling we can talk about later if you'd like on that. Interest in providing greater grade separation to the Paradise Path, particularly at places like State Highway 8 and 95. A lot of really positive feedback on your fixed route transit system, which is a relatively new addition to the community, but one that people seem to really value. As well as interest in reinstating transit service between Moscow and Pullman. One of our points of data was a community web survey that was open to the entire community. We got about 500 responses to that survey. We also surveyed passengers on the transit system, and about 60% of your riders responded to that survey, which is very high. We used social media, actually quite effectively in some cases. Some of the community workshops, we had a number of people said they showed up because of tweets or Facebook posts, so those were effective methods for us. So as we've identified the strategies and priorities that you see in the plan, all of those things in tandem really are contributing to the recommendations you see here. The guiding principles I talked through, the information that's documented in the transportation fact book, which is essentially a very nice existing conditions document. So if you ever have questions about how transportation works in Moscow, that's your place to go.